As you saw, this is Take Fountain. We got a great show for you today. If you've ever wondered when you're watching TV and they're kicking down the door and they got the gun in their hand and you're going, does it really happen like that? That seems sort of forced. I'm not sure is that real? I always wondered these things. I was talking with my co-host here, Tom Mount, many times about this, and I said, how does that happen? He says, well, there's a guy that they go to, and he tells us what's real and what isn't real. And he's been the go-to guy for the DEA for, decades now, I'm guessing?
Yes.
Decades. And you used him in movie after movie, as has everyone, and this is our opportunity to meet him. Explain who we have on the show today.
We are very lucky to have the always entertaining and wonderful and smart John Marcello. John Marcello, graduate of the University of Wisconsin, and Bill, you have informed me that those are the Badgers.
They're the Badgers.
Yeah. What the fuck is a Badger? No,
yeah, it's a Badgers. Yeah. By the way, I said they were Badgers, and everybody around here said I was lying. It shows you what great football fans we have here. Anyway.
So in any event, John is going to join us and walk through a bunch of the films he's worked on, television and films, and talk a little bit about the reality and the difference between policing, actual policing, and what you see in general in commercial entertainment.
So let's start with this. Hi, John, by the way. I'm not trying to ignore you. Nice to have you with us.
Nice to be here.
How did you two meet exactly? How did that work out?
Well, Tom, I sort of remember us meeting in a post facility when you were working on Tequila Sunrise.
That was our first face-to-face meeting, John, but we met on the phone when we were trying to figure out Scarface.
Scarface.
No, absolutely. That's right.
You sent me to all the right people in Miami and Oliver Stone, and that made the entire thing work.
So you made Scarface. I'm going to keep jumping in here. You made Scarface, and Scarface was basically the original Scarface was the Howard Hawks thing, which was about Capone, right?
Right.
But the Scarface that you did with Pacino and Michelle Pfeiffer and others, that was about the Miami drug trade, I guess. Cuban Miami connections and things of that nature.
John did a masterful job of hooking us up with the right people to decode the cocaine cowboy invasion of Miami.
Okay.
And that was a major drug event, major policing event. And Oliver and I went to Miami and spent a few weeks, and we saw amazing things.
So Oliver Stone is writing this.
Correct.
And he goes to Miami, and you go to Miami and do what exactly? You knock on the door of drug dealers? I don't understand. What is it you do exactly that helps you understand what this world of, what's his name, Tony Montana?
That's right,
Tony Montana.
So John has to explain Frank Torello to us.
Right. Well, first of all, when Tom first spoke to me and told me the project that they wanted to create, I thought it was terrific. We had been overrun with the Marielitos from Cuba, because these were mostly prisoners in Cuba that weren't political prisoners. These were just real crooks. And they filtered into Miami in the 80s, early 80s. And they took over and were the most violent people there in Miami. And I ran into them a lot in LA because they would bring their drugs to LA and we didn't encounter them in my work. So when Tom said he was going to do this, I thought it would be really a good project to highlight what was going on in Miami and LA at this time. And as a result, I put him in touch with an associate of mine named Frank Torello, who was like the deputy special agent in charge of the Miami Field Division for like 20 years. And he was terrific, knew everybody. And Frank said, I'll take care of him. And so Oliver and Tom went down there and Frank took care of him.
Yeah. And I will say, John, that was an eye-opening experience for Oliver and I. We were innocent, honestly, when we started that project about the intensity of the drug trade. And Frank and a very young DEA guy, whose name I cannot remember right now, but who was very, very nice. But Frank said, take these guys around and show them everything. So the next thing I know, we're meeting with some guys who are drug dealers. And then we meet with people who are cops. And then we meet with judges. And then we meet with reporters. And then we meet with bankers. And then we meet with some guy who has an airplane rental operation somewhere down around Homestead, who's making all of his money shipping drugs in and money out. And,
Right.
and that turned into several weeks of astonishingly authentic inside material. And I won't bore you right now, but we might hit on a couple of the things we encountered during that adventure.
When people come to you, John, and they say, I want to do a thing, you must watch television, by the way, all the time and go, that it would never happen that way. It would never happen. Do you see that, or is it over now? Now does everybody kind of get it right?
I think people are getting it right more now than ever. In the beginning, it was just sort of a hit and miss. But the good directors, the good writers, they would always want to know how we do things. And, you know, within our parameters, DEA I worked for the Drug Enforcement Administration. We were happy to cooperate because we wanted to see it right too. We didn't want to see our agents like pulling out a gun and shooting like a gangster and
Sure.
you know.
Yeah.
And so we would be there to help them and answer their questions. And you know, I talked to hundreds of writers. I didn't care if it was you know, a real visible name or if it was just some kid that called me right out of film school and said, hey, I'm trying to write a screenplay. I was glad to help them. Take 10 minutes to talk to them on the phone. You know, that's how it started with me. I was sort of the DEA guy that answered the phone for those people.
Do you remember, I'm sorry, do you remember your first film, the first one they called you in and said, hey, would you help us with this movie? What was that?
Well, I think it was, I had a friend named Gil Parra that was a sheriff's homicide detective. And he was, if you saw the movie Freebie and the Bean,
Yes.
Gil Parra was both Freebie and the Bean.
Okay.
Jimmy Kahn and Alan Arkin. And Gil worked with Floyd Mutrux, who wrote that film. And Floyd was setting out on a new project about prison gangs in MA in Los Angeles, and it was called America Me.
Yes.
It was made right away, but we worked on this film in the 70s, okay? And he worked on the script, and we were able to take Floyd and put him into our prison gang task force in Monterey Park, California. And Floyd had complete access in there, interviewed with the guys, listened to the informants come in and talk. And so I think that was our first big thing that we did, or I did,
Right.
with Hollywood, was America Me. Now,
American Me was a very scary movie. It felt very real. I mean, I remember that.
Oh, yeah.
right.
So,
And it was really wonderful. And Floyd got the part about a 13-year-old kid gets arrested and goes to Palm Hall and never gets out of prison and dies in prison. And in the meantime, this young man was trying to politically organize within the prisons, and of course, unfortunately, became a criminal enterprise called La MA, or the Mexican Mafia.
Right.
And Floyd he was right there on the forefront of it and was able to do that story.
So John, before we go any further, I want to back up for just a second about the history of John Marcello,
Okay.
because it's amazing. So John, after you finished being a Badger at the University of Wisconsin,
Right.
you went into the service, didn't you?
Right. I was in the Army, and I was a second lieutenant and a first lieutenant when I got out. I had to do a year overseas in Vietnam, and
John, so let me, without giving anything away, let me say that sounded a lot like military intelligence to me.
Well, I was commissioned as a infantry platoon officer, and I got very lucky because when I hit Vietnam, somebody came into Benoit Air Base and said, Marcello. I said, yes. How'd you like to go to a military intelligence unit? I said, I think I'd like that.
Yeah.
So I went there, and I was blessed in that I didn't have any serious issues in Vietnam, and we worked basically almost we were in civilian clothes a lot. We just worked there, and
Yeah. And so without giving too much away, let me just say, your job was to, let's say, influence the situation around the war. Would that be fair?
Well, of course, we're trying to, and basically trying to dig and find out who's who and how we can use various assets to assist us in our mission,
Yeah, and so that started you down the horrible path of,
Right.
of detective work, which is effectively what you've done all your life in one way or another. But when you got out of the military, as I remember, you found yourself on an airplane.
Right. I didn't know what I was going to do. I was going to either go to business school or law school. I got accepted at business school at USC, and I went for a month, and I decided that wasn't for me, so I thought I'd go to law school. In the meantime, I needed to eat, and a friend of mine told me about this brand new program called Sky Marshal program that Nixon formed in 1971, I believe it was, and I jumped on board. I was hired right away. Within 4 weeks, I was in training for 4 weeks back in DC, and I then became a SCAR Marshal and traveled all over. Never had an incident, thankfully, and
Right.
made it through. But it was a lot of fun, met a lot of nice people.
Right.
And that took me to my next position because that program was being managed by the Customs Agency. And the SAC of the Customs Agency came to me after a year and said, "Hey, how would you like to be a special agent with U.S. Customs?" So I said, "Why not? I'm not in school yet. I might as well do that." And then I worked for Customs for a couple of years. And then Nixon again, he liked forming, I guess, agencies. So he formed the Drug Enforcement Administration, and he combined 1,500 Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs agents and 500 customs agents into this new outfit. So I was a charter member of the DEA, and that was 1973.
I can't believe that DEA has only been around since I don't remember life before the DEA.
I know.
Right.
So were you undercover a fair amount, or did you never do that?
No, I worked undercover as a young man.
Okay.
And then as my roles changed within DEA, the need for an old guy like me to go undercover wasn't in high demand.
Was that frightening at times?
Oh, of course. You're always, if you're not frightened, you're not really very smart about what you're doing. You got to be a little bit afraid of.
Give me an example of something that was frightening. Tell me something if you can. I don't know. Maybe you're not allowed to talk about some of this stuff.
For me personally, it wasn't horrible, but it was always horrible when I had my partners in compromising positions, where they go into a location and they're by themselves, and you're only 30 seconds away, but things can happen in 30 seconds. And there was an incident where an LAPD officer who was working with us, the feds, up in Santa Monica, and he was in the Holiday Inn up there, and they were counting the money. It was like a $200,000 exchange, and we were going to buy the drugs, so we had the money. And the bad guy counted the money twice, and then he asked to be excused to go to the bathroom in the hotel room, and he came out of the bathroom and shot and killed our undercover agent. And,
right.
And we were outside in the next room. We were right there, and that's the kind of stuff that could happen and did happen.
Yeah.
And I assume that since that particular scenario, I mean, as you're describing it, I think I've seen that in movies like 100 times. So you're looking at scripts and saying, this is how it works, this is how it happens, and you work on things like with Michael Mann. If I'm correct here, you work with Michael Mann on Heat, right? Is that one of them?
Yeah. The only thing that I did with Michael works with a lot of people. He wants to know everything about every character.
Yes.
And so he, when he had Pacino, he put me with Pacino because Pacino was the cop. And then De Niro, he put with Gil Parra.
Yeah.
Because Parra was a sheriff, but he was an expert on the jails, and he could bring De Niro to criminals in the jails that he could interview and learn from. So, yeah, and Michael had many people, they had SWAT team members. They had police. He must have had 30 people working on that film.
So if you're working on the film and you're sitting there with Pacino, is he asking you stuff? Are you telling him things? What's exactly happening? I just
Yeah,
don't I want you to paint the picture of what exactly you do for a movie.
No, actually, with that particular movie, I have been on. I'll tell you about the Pacino. It's just basically in a hotel room because you can't go anywhere with Pacino. Everybody knows him, you know.
Yeah.
So when Michael brought him to me, we were in a private room, but he wanted to know everything about, you know, every detail of my investigations, how I worked them, how I interviewed people, what I did after I arrested people, when I went home, how did you unwind. So it was like that. Now, we worked with Michael Mann on Drug Wars, the Camarena series. It was a 6-hour miniseries that actually we won the best miniseries that year. And that was about the kidnapping and murder of our agent, Enrique Kiki Camarena. And Michael asked Jack Lawn, the administrator of our agency, if I could be with them from day one before one word was written. So I worked with them, writing when they were writing. I worked with them as a technical advisor. I worked with the actors. I was on the set every day. But that was a rarity for me because I usually didn't have the time.
Right.
I'm really a special agent with DEA. I have to go out there and arrest people.
Sure.
So I didn't have my life to dedicate to Hollywood, but I did on that particular project because it was so close to home. My agency wanted me out there, and I was out there.
So let's talk for just a second about Gil Parra. I met Gil and met you through Gil, and Floyd Mutrix, the writer-director, knew Gil. I don't know how exactly. And as I remember, John, one evening we ended up in a disreputable Larry Flint-owned casino somewhere on the edge of Orange County, giving Gil an award. And the guy sitting at the table with us was Antonio Villaraigosa, who became mayor of Los Angeles shortly thereafter. And Gil was, I believe, the first Latin person to run homicide for the sheriff's department. Is that right?
If not the first, one of the first. But I think he was the first. And he was wonderful. He just had he had the ability to ferret things out and solve problems. And it's a great investment.
I just want the audience to know that if I called Marcello and I said, let's have lunch, he'd say, well, I'll meet you at the farmer's market. And that would be a little upstairs area at the farmer's market where people wouldn't bother you. But then Gil would show up. And then another guy would show up, and I'd say, who is that? And he'd say, oh, that's the head of the bomb squad. And then another guy would show up, and he's the head of this, and he's the head of that. And pretty soon there's 6 police officers from all sorts of organizations around the table swapping lies about their lives. And it was, as a movie guy, it was heaven.
Right.
They had to be eye-opening situations for you. I mean, because you must have been led into things where you went like, I didn't know this was all going on under my nose.
All the time.
Give me examples of that, the two of you, or whatever.
John, will you tell briefly the Grand Mal Mafia story?
Oh, right. We had an organization of women they lived in Beverly Hills, and they were grandmothers, and they were attractive women. You know, they were like in their late 50s, but they were very attractive. Beverly Hills, like housewives, but they weren't married. And they met Colombian traffickers, and they started to carry money only from between Miami and Los Angeles. But they would carry Samsonite suitcases, and they'd be filled with anywhere from $600,000 to $800,000 a trip. And they did this for like about 3 years before we stumbled onto them and started our investigation. And it was hilarious. And it's one of the, I think, best unproduced scripts out there right now. I think.
How come that isn't a movie? How come you're not making a movie out of that? Because that's a great idea, isn't it? To get someone you'd never suspect just carrying around their Samsonite luggage full of $800,000.
Right, and nobody would touch them because they flew first class. They were
Yeah.
nice, rich people from Beverly Hills. If anybody did a quick background, everything was true. You know, they were Beverly Hills housewives, basically.
Do you remember how you caught them? Do you remember what the break was?
Yeah, I think we were. I think we were at the airport. Yeah, one of my guys at the airport. I had the airport group for a long time, and we did a lot of a dirty word here, folks. Profiling.
Yes.
This is what doctors do when you come in and tell them,
Yes.
I got certain issues, and they profile. Well, we would profile couriers and people that were drug dealers, and every once in a while, and most of the time, it was. We would just walk up to people and say, we're federal narcotics. Do you mind talking to me for a few minutes? And we kind of watching their eyes and watching how they react. And I don't know why one of our guys walked up to one of these women and asked if they could talk to her for a while. And then I guess she started to demonstrate some, attitude that she didn't want to talk to him. And our response was always, let them go. In other words, don't make a scene here at the airport. Just let them go. We'll find out who they are and we'll take a look. And that's exactly what happened. So it was one of these innocuous approaches.
Yeah.
And then she got scared, and our officer was smart enough to know, hey, I'm going to back off of this one, but I'm not going to forget it. And so came back in the office, and then we started doing work, and we were able to connect them to people that were Colombian drug dealers.
So, Bill, having had the experience of walking down a corridor at LAX with John Marcello,
Yeah.
that experience is unique because John and his team of people, remember that John ran the task force at LAX, which was a unique policing organization with a couple of members from 5 or 6 different policing organizations, all grouped together to run the policing of this entire airport, which is a small city. I mean, it's a massive airport,
sure.
and a lot of people, millions of people, and 52 flights an hour and stuff like that. So you'd walk down the hall with John, and he would say, as we pass a group of people, he'd kind of point at someone and say, prize fight in Las Vegas tonight. I'd say, how do you know that? He'd say, because those hookers are getting on the Vegas flight. And then a couple of minutes later, he'd say, guys who don't want to meet us, they're going home, but they don't speak English yet. And they're guys who'd come in and dropped off drugs or money, and they were going back. And he would know it. And then they keep, and one person after another, and you realize as you walk by 1,000 people in a corridor at LAX, 150 of them are crooks.
It's funny when you say that. This comes to my mind. I think that we're we civilians in this are really naive about this stuff. And I did a piece once with David Hartman years ago on cops, and it was like cops before cops, but it was like that. We rode around in a squad car. We did it in Newport Beach, we did it in Houston, we did it in New York, and a few other places. But the one in New York, I said it was in the center of the crack cocaine. It's like 84, 85. Crack is ravaging the city. And they said, we need to cover this. And I went to the whatever that department was, and I said, I want you to take me the worst neighborhood you've got. I want to see the worst examples of what's happening with crack. And he said, okay, meet me tomorrow at 3 in the afternoon at 89th and Amsterdam. And I said, I live at 89th and Amsterdam. I don't want to, that's not what I mean the bad areas. The Bronx, and what in my mind was, the parts of, he says, no, there's no worse area than where you live. So when I arrived, I realized that all these guys that had been around me every day, passing on the street and whatever, that many of them drug dealers. And I just hadn't picked up on it. And then they confronted somebody, and they put they put crack in a tennis ball, which I'd never seen before. And they put it in a tennis ball because you can throw it, right? So you could get rid of it. It could go bounding down the street, down 89th Street toward Columbus Avenue, and then they could run the other way. And I only bring this up because I don't think that I think that probably when you went to Miami, if I go to Miami, I think this is a lovely town. What a great town. you go to Miami with you guys, it's like, oh man.
John knows well because he's seen it all, but one of the things they took Oliver and I to see in Miami, they took us to a corner, and on the corner was a bank. And the guy said, wait just a few minutes. We're sitting there looking around. It's all nice. We don't know what the hell we're doing on the corner by the bank. A car pulls up. It's actually a truck pulls up. Guy gets around the back of the truck, comes out, gets a giant army duffel bag, puts it on his shoulder, and carries it into the bank. And he says, we just wanted you to see that. And he said, what's that? He said, that's a drug deposit. There's
Right.
probably $3 or $4 million in there, maybe $5 million. And he's just taking the bank, and they're going to help him launder it. And I said, well, how are these bankers not in jail? He said, oh, we have too much going on in this town. If we arrested every banker, there wouldn't be banks in Miami.
Wow.
And so,
That's the way it was in that era. And then we had money laundering laws that came into effect that changed a lot of that. And
Right.
Not
Right.
seeing any of that now, but it's the biggest problem for these criminals is how to get the cash back to their countries.
yeah. So then, John, you also ran around, as I remember, with a bunch of other cops. I think I remember Frank Salerno. Wasn't that a friend of yours?
Well, he was a friend of Gill's.
A friend of Gill's, yeah.
I met Salerno and Finnegan was his partner, and they did the Hillside Strangler case.
Right.
And Gill was their best friend. Everybody on the sheriff's department, sheriff's department homicide were a very excellent group of investigators, and they had some tough cases in this town, and that was one of them. And Salerno is legendary. I mean, and Finnegan's retired now, I believe. Salerno was he just had the patience and the time. They worked hard. That movie, I don't know if that movie ever got made. I know the script that I know they were working on didn't get made, but there may have been some TV knockoff or something that somebody did. There's Gil Carrillo was a younger homicide detective brought in that ran with Gil, and Salerno and Gil Carrillo did the Richard Ramirez case, which was the Night Stalker.
Night Stalker case, yep.
And so, yeah, they were, I think the sheriffs and LAPD too were open to working with Hollywood as well, because they wanted to see it done right and they wanted the story told right, you know? So
You
they would
worked,
work.
you worked on things that I wouldn't think you'd need a consultant for, say, Beverly Hills Cop. I don't know why, in my mind, or even what's the other Marty Brest movie that's so great?
Midnight Run.
Midnight Run. I wouldn't think that these are comedies. You actually work on those movies, right?
Right, I did. Well, Beverly Hills Cop was interesting because I hadn't done a lot of Hollywood work up to that time. I did, like the stuff with Floyd that we talked about. But Marty came to me from Paramount because they saw my name in some LexisNexis court case involving a thing called the switch, where products would come into America in cargo containers that had to be in bonded warehouses before they could be released. And then similar products would come into the same warehouse on the same night in similar boxes that came from Kansas City, for instance. One came from Afghanistan and one came from Kansas City. And the Kansas City one was filled with Korans, and the one from Afghanistan was filled with hashish.
Right.
Yeah. So, and then during the night in the facility, the airline facility, they would switch tags on the cargo. And
Right.
so that night when customs is not on duty at the airport, the so-called now domestic product would go out the door, and the foreign product would stay in the cargo warehouse. So they did the switch, got the dope out of the place. So I worked on a case like that at LAX and put a bunch of employees in jail. So they read about that and they came over. That was one question. They wanted to know how they can incorporate that into the movie. And then two, they were interested in my opinion. They said they were going to have, I think they said Sylvester Stallone was going to play.
Yeah, he was
Yeah,
the
Murphy.
first person they tried
Yeah,
to-
that's right. Stallone was supposed to be Beverly Hills Cop, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. But they said and Marty Brest came to the airport with some Paramount people. And I think Waylon Green was there too. the writer.
Wally Green, screenwriter.
Walter Green, I'm sorry. And they they said, we really want to know. We're thinking we're gonna use Eddie Murphy in this film. Is it possible for a black Detroit cop to come to Los Angeles International Airport and badge his way into the customs warehouse? And I said, yes.
Yeah.
And they loved it.
But they were concerned about that because at that time.
They were concerned about that because they didn't want to have the audience go, this is not believable. This guy couldn't do that, you know? And so I took Marty, the two of us, over to a particular airline, I won't name it. And I badged the kid behind the counter and said, have your supervisor come here, federal narcotics, we gotta go check for some cargo in the bonded warehouse. He said, yes, sir. And the manager came out. I didn't even have to show him my ID again. I mean, I would have, but I didn't have to. And I said, we need to go in and just to make sure there's not a particular product in there that we think is on the loose. And yes, sir. And he came with us. He didn't let us roam around in there.
Sure.
But we were in there and we're looking around, and then we left. And then I remember there was a kid back in the corner out front again. When we got out front into the main office, there was a kid in the corner. And so I went one step further. I said, hey, can we look at the airway bills just to make sure that are in that customs warehouse right now? And of course, the manager told the kid, he says, get the airway bills for these gentlemen. And the kid looked at me, and I don't know what it was. I saw this red Porsche when I came in there into the parking lot, and I thought, that red Porsche is an employee parking lot there. Yeah. That's not right. It's not right for the kind of money these people make.
Right.
It was a Carrera, so the kid said to me, he said, well, who are you guys? Do you have a right to? Now his manager's right there telling him to do it. He says, who are you guys, and do you have a right to look at this stuff? And I said, you know who we are. And I said, is that your red Porsche out there? And the kid put his head down. And I said, don't worry, I'm not going to call IRS tomorrow. Well, if any of you saw Beverly Hills Cop, you saw that scene in Beverly Hills Cop.
Yeah.
So that's how sometimes it works, not always. But.
Yeah. It was a fish, and as you talk about it, I realize that there's a sort of a fish out of water story in Beverly Hills Cop, right? Which is he sees himself as a real cop, right? Put in with this very soft crowd of Beverly Hills Police Department, right?
Right.
Yeah, I can see where, the more you talk about it, the more I could see where it would be important to have that authenticity in that movie. Otherwise, it's not going to be as funny, probably. You know?
And I knew it would. I knew that. I knew just enough about Eddie Murphy. I never worked with him or anything, but just from watching him, that he could pull that off.
Yeah.
And there were in the LAPD and the LA sheriffs, there were plenty of Black and Hispanic people that could go in there and do the same thing. So why couldn't Eddie Murphy do it?
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you also ended up, I think, I may be wrong about this, but did you consult with Michael Mann at all on Last of the Mohicans?
No, I didn't, but I was around him when we were Michael was producing Drug Wars, the Camarena story.
Right.
At the same time, he was in pre-production then production on Last of the Mohicans. So we were in the same room all the time. One thing about Last of the Mohicans that Michael did, he was just such a professional, and he was such. I'll give you a good example. I got out of the Wisconsin with maybe a 3.1 average, and only because I took a lot of easy courses at the end, Otherwise, I would have been a lot lower. But Mike calls up one day and says, hey, did you read Last of the Mohicans? And I said, yeah, in high school, I think I did read it. And he says, you still have the book? I said, yeah, I do. He says, well, read it this weekend and get back to me. I mean, he wanted me to read Last of the Mohicans. And after I read it, he sent me a script, and he wanted me to read the script. And I thought it was, it was pure Michael.
So, John, what people don't understand is that gradually, over time of consulting for people, you also began to write screenplays. And you wrote actually a lot of scripts. You wrote a lot of treatments. You made notes on other people's screenplays that got incorporated before they shot, both television and television. Didn't you? Weren't you deeply involved in a Fox television series once? Do I remember that?
There were actually, yeah. Well, I mean, I think there were a few. There was one initially called DEA, and it only lasted for 13 weeks. So I'm not going to take a lot of credit for that one. But there was another one that we did. Are you thinking of the more recent one? Was called? Oh no, it was with Sean Daniel.
Yeah,
and Jim yeah. Graceland, they called it.
Graceland, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was on for 3 years, and I wasn't a writer on it, but I was an advisor, and it came from an idea of mine about putting a bunch of task force agents in a seized Malibu beach house, and working out of there, and so that was fun. I liked. I think one of the things that you did, which was Tequila Sunrise and Blow. I think this would be a good example, Bill. In Blow, the main character in Tequila Sunrise was played by Mel Gibson, and he was a Manhattan Beach, California crook who smuggled cocaine, and he was based on that person. And so Thom produced Tequila Sunrise. Years later, there was a movie called Blow.
Yeah, I remember it. Yeah.
And Ted Demme was the director, the late Ted Demme, a wonderful human being.
Yeah.
And they did again. They were doing research on Blow, and they saw my name connected to this guy in Manhattan Beach. So they reached out to me, and they sent me the script. And he wanted me to read the script and make notes, and I did. And I made very good notes, sent it back right away. Typically, heard nothing. One day they call me in. He's got the whole production office there, and grill me for like a day and a half. And it was wonderful because I was able to help them. I knew the story cold. I lived the story, part of it. I lived the LA part of the story. And I was able to help them. And it made me feel good when I saw the movie because it was pretty realistic.
Sure. And on Tequila Sunrise, so can we talk about that particular drug dealer who's a public figure?
Sure.
And if you don't mind using his name, and talk a little bit about that interaction and what was his nickname?
Richie was his name. He probably had many. I don't recall, Tom.
Yeah, was it Richie Ross? Was that his name?
No, that was someone else.
That's another drug dealer.
That's another drug dealer.
Yeah, that was Freeway Ricky Ross. Okay.
Yeah, that was Freeway Rick. But this particular guy's passed away now. He died in Mexico.
He was the hair cutter, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was a tonsorial parlor. He cut hair, but he was an Italian kid from Massachusetts. He had a nice, he was a very smart and very sharp businessman. And he just came out here and started this tonsorial parlor in Manhattan Beach. And he went on to run marijuana first and then cocaine. And he became one of the Pablo Escobar's main distributors of cocaine in the early days when Pablo was still basically nobody.
Right.
But
and as I remember, Richie and I, without using names, let's just say that I knew some directors and some writers of some stature, an occasional star, who counted Richie's phone number on their cell phones with on their dial-up, He was really servicing the west side of Hollywood, that's for sure.
Right. And what it grew from that, from Tequila Sunrise, from the Tequila Sunrise story, it grew from like a good violator, a good, multi-kilo person. Literally, Tom, once he met Pablo Escobar, it grew to hundreds of kilos at a time.
Wow.
And he was delivering hundreds of kilos to Hollywood. And it was before our money laundering laws were in effect. And so a lot of what he got away with then, he wouldn't have got away with later. And subsequently, he got arrested when he was at the airport one day, and I was there with my partner and on unrelated business. And we saw him with a man that appeared to be Colombian and the man was taking a flight to Miami. And as a result, Richie knew me, so he saw me and he kind of panicked. I could see the panic. And so I knew the man he was seeing off was important. My partner went to the gate and found out who he was. And Richie and I talked. And like we always talk, we would see each other in Manhattan Beach and talk. And, he knew who I was. I knew who he was, you know. So what happened was we called Miami that day, and they got $600,000 out of a suitcase from the Colombian that was on it.
Right.
And that was Richie's payment to him for one of Pablo Escobar's loads. That was the overt act that put Richie in jail after all these years.
Wow.
You know.
So, John, as I remember, you had very fancy offices at LAX.
Over time.
When I first saw you guys, you were in a double wide trailer, weren't you?
That's right. Actually, that was one of our nicest offices. In fact, a cute anecdote. Jerry Brown, the governor,
Yeah.
Before, I think he used to come and park his car in there, and he'd come always. He was very polite. He'd always come in and say, "John, is it okay if I park my car here for the weekend? I'm going up." And he had no security, no anybody. Yeah, sure, Gov, go ahead. Park your car there. And eventually, we got nice office spaces in at LAX.
Oh man. Well, I loved it that you were kind of on the fly. You know, there was a
Right.
sense that the task force would make things happen at LAX. I also remember once I said, "What are you doing, John? Let's go have lunch." And you said, "No, I can't. I'm watching a Ferrari." And I said, "What are you doing watching?" He said, "Well, there's a Ferrari here that I got to watch." And it was sent in, and it's going to be picked up by the son of a Saudi Arabian prince. And
Right.
I said, "Yeah, and what's interesting about that Ferrari?"
It was loaded. Right?
Yeah, filled with,
Cocaine.
yeah,
Yeah.
filled with cocaine. Ferrari stuffed with cocaine.
Really?
Sent
Right.
in.
Is there any other kind of Ferrari?
Yeah. Those are the kind of things that happened out there, you know, and, you know, but the task force was a wonderful concept. And I have to give credit to LAPD and the sheriffs and to DEA for coming up with that concept. And it ran really until 9/11. Tom knows very well that there was a script that I helped write called Common Ground that has yet to be made too, about LAX.
Actually,
And,
I want to get into that because I find anything that's really, you think that's the perfect movie, I can't wait to see that, and it doesn't get made. I find that strange about Hollywood.
Yeah.
And yet there are dozens and dozens of these, aren't there? Tell me about Common Ground.
Well, Common Ground came into my life through John and Floyd Mutrix, who worked on it together and wrote it together. And Common Ground was a name for a section of ground, literally, at LAX. John, do you want to explain that?
Sure. Basically, it's the west side of the airport where they had in the day in the 70s and 80s, there were, say, $100,000 homes up on the hill overlooking the ocean. Well, because of the noise of the new jets, they did an eminent domain and seized all those homes and plowed them all under. But it's an eerie kind of a look. It's still got the concrete streets are still there now, overgrown with grass, and so you see the subdivision like on the west side of the airport that's vacant. And we came up, well, Floyd and I came up with the idea that our movie might begin and end there. On something we called Common Ground. The short version is Floyd and I worked on it, and it was an idea that I had, and it was about sort of loosely based on our task force at LAX. And well, I mean, it was the task force, but of course it was a drama, and it involved a criminal that was a masterful criminal that was going to take down the Federal Reserve, a Federal Reserve money shipment.
Right.
And without going into that detail, it was a wonderful story. And again, it was about how smart this guy was and how he knew the airport cold. And of course, our hero in the piece ran the task force, and he was just as smart. And it, you know, culminated at LAX with a big closing scene, and they blew up the old tower that was there. You know?
Yeah.
And Tom saw the beauty. You know, it was just a fun action movie, and Tom saw the value in it and took it to Paramount, I believe, and
Right.
they were backing it. Now you know the rest of the story better than I do.
Well, what was terrific about that movie was the script was great.
Yeah.
And as a result, we got Billy Friedkin, who's a terrific director of action pictures,
Right.
you know, to attach himself as a director. And then we went to John Travolta to play the role of John Marcello.
Right.
And so Travolta said yes, and we began to have a package together, and then we started budgeting the picture. And you remember, John, that Bill Gilmore was my line guy, and
Right.
Bill went to work on the budget. Bill had done a million movies. He was also the line guy on Midnight Run, I should say, line producer.
Okay.
And ultimately, this movie was going to cost, by the time we did it the way the director wanted to do it, which was the full bore version. In those days, this was a lot of money. It was about $58 million.
Yeah.
A lot of money in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
Paramount wanted to spend $35 million. I had worked with Billy Friedkin before. We co-financed The Sorcerer, a remake of Wages of Fear.
Boy, do I love that movie.
Yeah, and
That's
Paramount
such. If
and
you've
I
never seen The Sorcerer, must go see it. It's an incredible film. But yes, go ahead.
So in any event, but Billy, I got to say, had a hair-triggered temper. On The Sorcerer, we had a preview, very bad preview with the director's cut, because the director's cut was so long, and the then senior administrative executive of Universal was a man named Sid Sheinberg. He was at that screening, and as Billy was at the screening, and it didn't go very well. And Billy came out in the lobby, and Sid was standing there, and Sid went over to Billy and started wagging his finger in Billy's face.
Yeah.
And said, "You're going to have to cut 30 minutes out of this movie, and I'm telling you, we are and we this and we that." At which point, Billy Friedkin turned around, looked around at the room, cold-cocked Sid Sheinberg, and walked off.
Wow.
And
I like
nobody,
that.
And nobody said a word.
I love
and
that.
everybody's like, Sid couldn't believe that somebody had actually hit him. And Sid was a big guy,
Yeah.
you know, and this did not warm everybody's heart at Universal to Billy as long as Sid was there.
Well, it's also one of those movies that there are no women in it. It has like 5 lines of dialogue. It's basically a truck full of nitroglycerin, a bunch of trucks full of nitroglycerin or something,
That's
making their
right.
way across. It's hair raising, but it's not a kind of movie that.
Yeah.
It's hard to get behind that movie if you're probably a movie executive, I would guess.
So now John and Floyd are suffering through the fact that they have a great script and we have a great director for it. Billy really understood Common Ground and loved it, and loved the sense of humor the guys had baked into it, even though it was a very serious action picture. And we had a star who also loved it and who Paramount was excited about. We just had this huge budget gap. And we had another problem that I hadn't counted on as a problem, and that is that Billy Friedkin was married to Sherry Lansing,
Right.
who was then president of Paramount, running the place.
You would think that would be a good thing.
Well, no. You know, the kind of intramural politics of a studio are always about the blame game. And so inside a studio, people are constantly looking. If there's going to be a failure, they want to know who to pin it on, and they want to have some people to pin it on. And if there's going to be a success, people that never heard of the movie take that credit.
Sure.
So this is very much like, using Sid Sheinberg's, very much like Sid Sheinberg claiming credit for E.T., a movie which he said to me, "We're not making this movie because it'll only be popular with children." And so fine, okay, take all the credit you want.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
and so now we find ourselves in a mess because we can't get the picture launched. And
Right.
Paramount owns the damn thing because they've paid everybody,
Right.
and Mount Company.
So they're not going to make it, and they're not going to let it go.
That's right. And so I go to them and start trying to pry it loose, and I spend, maybe 2 years trying to pry it loose, to no effect, to no avail. Script's too good to let go, and worse than that, somebody else might make it and have a hit.
That's exactly right. You can't have that happen.
Can't
Better to
have
let
that
it
happen.
die on the vine, right?
Yep. Better to bury it somewhere.
Wow.
So, John, you eventually retired from the DEA. When you retired, as I remember, you were in charge of a lot of wire activity, weren't you?
Yeah, for 1 year. my last year, I was the supervisor of what we called the wire room. I mean, it's the electronic surveillance intercept room or whatever they call it now. Today, they probably have a fancier name. But basically, we did wiretaps, and the guys there were terrific. And it was an era. It was sort of the new era. You know, it wasn't my era. My era was like when I first worked undercover, Bill, Joe Moody, an old buddy of mine who ran the prison task force, he taught me everything I needed to know about buying dope.
Yeah.
And I said, Joe, what do you do? And he says, you take some money and you go meet the crook and you say, here's the money, give me the dope. And it happens, and you walk away, and we'll do the rest.
So it was pretty simple. It's simpler back then. You're saying.
Yeah, it was similar back then. Yeah. So anyway, it was like that in the wire room. The wire room was a whole different concept, and it was basically very interesting for me to be able to be that supervisor for the last year, and see where the direction that law enforcement was going. And we really had a great group of young men and women that worked in that room and did some good work.
No, wait a second. This is a room full of, I mean, I'm sure that there are things you can't talk about here, but I'll just plow ahead. This is a room full of people listening 24 hours a day. Am I right?
Right.
Shift work. It's like 24 hours a day. They're listening to drug dealers, politicians, businessmen.
Well, we weren't so much, unless they were dealing dope, we weren't so much into the politicians or the business. Our things were mostly Mexican and Colombian major traffickers talking to their associates here. And we had a room, they weren't all special agents. We had contract employees that spoke the languages and listened, but we had agents supervising every shift. So if anything hot came up over the wire that needed immediate action, we had agents there that could pick up a phone, and we had LAPD and sheriffs and other agencies working with us. So if we needed to put 10 guys on the street right now, that supervisor of that shift could get those guys out there.
I always wondered. Go ahead. Finish your thought. I'm sorry.
No, it was just that we worked at 24 hours, and it was a lot of work, and a lot of good work.
As you're listening, and all of a sudden somebody starts speaking Portuguese, Arabic, something. Do you immediately go, oh hell, we've got to find some so and so somewhere fast? Or I mean, how does that work?
Well, without going into a lot of detail, we had assets that could speak probably every language in the world, and we would have to go back to a place, I'm not going to name the state or the location, where they had a room full of people, and they had phone numbers of everybody they could call instantaneously and get that back to us in like 15 minutes, So it was a good situation, and it was an expensive situation.
Yeah.
And
So
I'm
John,
glad I did that at the end.
That's fascinating.
I want to wind out here in a minute because we're about to run out of time, but I need to hit two things before we go. One is I want you to explain what redrum means and what that project was.
Well, that's how, it's actually how I first met Gil Parra, because there were a lot of murders down in Miami and New York, LA, Bogota, in the 70s, in the late 70s, when the Colombians decided we're no longer just going to sell this dope to Americans and let them distribute it. We're going to distribute it ourselves.
Right.
And as a result, they sent soldiers up there. Like in Miami, they had Cuban traffickers, they had Colombian traffickers. Those people fought all the time, killed each other. So
SCARFACE.
The short story is red rum is murder spelled backwards, okay? Mm-hmm. So the DEA designated an agent in every office, every major field office, to be the coordinator of the Red Rum program, to coordinate with the local police officers, homicide people. So when they get a homicide that looks like it's drug related, we'll get all that intelligence into the computer systems and share it in Bogota, New York, Miami, LA. And I happen to be the guy that had that additional duty in Los Angeles, and that's how I met Gil Parra, the homicide investigator.
Right. And thank you for closing that loop and explaining that to people, and that is its own movie. Bill, talking about unmade movies, the Red Rum Project. Call it Red Rum, and
it's like The Shining. Wasn't it The Shining where they said red rum all the time?
Yes. Yes. So then, John, you retired from the DEA and you went immediately and opened a private investigation agency, which you're currently doing. It's called Phoenix. And you do a lot of things for a lot of people. We're not going to go into much of that detail since you can't do that. But we can go into one story because it's a story I got involved in. Without naming the company, let's say that there was a prominent entertainment company in Los Angeles, which I was tasked with selling on behalf of the owners. And to do that, I had to, among other things, do an accounting, a forensic accounting of the company. When I did that, I discovered that in the company, 2 or 3 of the very senior officers of the company had embezzled many millions of dollars, gone, unaccounted for. And in particular, the general counsel for the company, the senior legal advisor for the company, had taken out, I don't know, John, $5 or $6 million in the space of about 2 years. And he was living in a very nice house up in Bel Air with his wife and family, and he was a well-known figure in the entertainment industry. And I had to bring this to closure somehow. So John, and who did you bring with you, John? You brought a partner.
I knew I was going to need an IRS agent, so I brought one of my friends that worked major narcotics cases with us, an IRS agent that worked those cases, and he was retired as well, had a PI license. So I brought him, and the two of us met with Thom, got briefed, and then Thom told him what happened after that.
Well, so I had already talked to the management of the people that own the company, and they said, look, do everything you can to get some of this money back, because all this money had gone out the door. So John had an idea, and he said, let's do this. Let's take the conference room at the company, and let's invite the general counsel to come in and talk to us, because I think we've got a proposal that might work. Well, the guy's a lawyer, and he's not just a lawyer, he's a well-known lawyer in the business. So we take a conference room, and it's John and his IRS agent and myself on one side of the table, and we bring in our general counsel on the other side of the table. And John said, and John, I'm going to paraphrase you. If I'm doing this wrong, please just rewrite me.
Okay.
John said, you know, you're a really, really well-respected attorney. You got a long history of practicing law. I suspect you wouldn't want to lose your ability to practice. He said, you've also got a nice house. By this time, John and his team had done their research. Your house is worth whatever, $2.5, $3 million, some number like that. And so then we're in this problem. There's this money that's missing, and here's all the paperwork that supports it. And all of this has flowed into your office and then ultimately into your bank. And so we're about to go to the DA with all this. But what we'd like to do is see if we can find a way to recapture as much of this money as possible. So the guy's freaking out. First he says, oh, I didn't do it. Remember, John, he said, I thought it was a bonus. I thought it was a gift. People left cash on my desk, and I just took the cash home, put it in the bank. Well, you know, somebody leaves $5 million on your desk, even over a period of a year, what a normal person would ask, what is this?
You would question that, I think.
You would question that,
Yeah.
you know. And so John said, listen, he said, we don't have a lot of time. We're going to have to go to the district attorney today. So then now the guy turns bright red. He's really panicked. And John said, so here's what we're going to do. We've got a document here that you can sign. I want you to quit claim the right to your house back to this company. And we'll sell the house and recapture some of the money you've taken. And the guy goes, oh, I can't do that. What am I going to say? My wife and my things. And then, if we were really planning your future, you'd be better off somewhere other than the U.S. And the guy said, oh, what am I? And then John said, and I'm going to give you an hour. Because in 1 hour, we are going to the district attorney, who will find this story really interesting. And the guy ran out of the room. And 40 minutes later, John, he came back
Right.
in a room with a signed document, turned his house over to the company, scooped up his wife and kids, and moved to France.
Wow.
And we got about $3 million of the $5 million back.
What do we say, Tom? Case closed?
Case closed. So I would just say anybody out there needs a private eye, and I've used John's company many
Oh.
times since. They're a wonderful PI organization. They do all sorts of cool things, and helped me with some help from an FBI digital investigator. Recently helped me in a case in which someone had forged documents and presented them to the court. And John said, I know who can figure out that that's forged. And they did. And, you know, it's a skill set that I just don't have in my day-to-day life. So, Bill, when someone decides that they're ripping you off in some amazing way, or some of your friends get
Right.
taken advantage of, I say call Phoenix.
Have him on
first.
speed dial, exactly right.
That's right.
You know, I know that John was cool when it's just a callback when he said that Michael Mann called him and said, read the old James Fenimore Cooper novel, I'm Gonna Do Last of the Mohicans. Obviously, it tells you a little bit about this business. At a certain point, you start out consulting how to do drug busts, and then eventually you go like, well, this guy has great instincts. I'm going to ask him about a Western I'm about to make.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so that I think speaks very well of you, and I just wanted to thank you for, unless there's anything further, I wanted to thank you, John Marcello, for being with us today. That was terrific.
It's my pleasure, Bill and Tom. And always, you know, I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you very much. And if I can do anything else for you, let me know.
All right.
John, I think they can, and we are very, very happy to have
I'm
you.
thinking of things you could do for me now. I'm just going through. I'm going through them mentally.
Yeah, and we're very happy to have you with us virtually here in beautiful downtown Rancho Mirage.
Exactly.
And Bill?
Until next time, I'll remind you that's our show for today. There are no shortcuts in showbiz, but there are many, many detours, as we have seen. This is Bill Getty with Tom Mount, advising you to take Fountain.